Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Radical Stories from Scotland You Should Know About. This is the first video in what is going to be a series on this channel. This series was created to share inspirational stories that, in my eyes, have historical importance. When some folk think of Scotland, they tend to think of castles and ancient battles, and often the fighting spirit of some of those in our recent history is overlooked or ignored. I'd like to talk about those who have stood against the sometimes overwhelming powers that be and highlight just how they affected change. Let me preface this series by stating that the intent of this isn't to invoke national pride in our past, because obviously we played no role in that, but it is to show examples of actions taken by Scotland's working class and ponder what lessons we can learn from them here and now. This first episode is about Mary Barbour and the rent strikes. To understand the story of Mary Barbour and her army of rent strikers, it's necessary to give context to the period in which they occurred. The year is 1914, and Britain is fighting to keep its place as a global imperial superpower. Jingoism was rife during this period, and within a couple of months of World War I beginning, a quarter of Scotland's male workforce had enlisted to fight. Scotland's main industrial centres were suddenly without the workers they had just a year prior. With so many jobs essential to the running of the country now vacant, thousands of people flocked to Glasgow to take them up. Glasgow was already infamous for its squalid living conditions, and thousands of new workers demanding accommodation only served to fuel the housing crisis. As the demand for housing grew, opportunist landlords, or slumlords as they had been affectionately nicknamed, looked to seize the chance to make some quick money. With thousands of men engaged in war overseas and the women left in charge at home, landlords seen what they thought was an easy target. They began to hike rent prices to a point where working men and women couldn't afford them any longer. Despite the shockingly bad conditions of Glasgow's tenements, rent was higher here than in other parts of the UK. Over a third of rents in the UK had increased by 5%, whilst in working class districts of Glasgow like Govan, they had risen up to 23% higher than pre-war levels. Communities were already incensed by their living conditions, and as their rent increased and their neighbours were evicted, the anger only grew. However, by thinking that the women of Glasgow were a soft touch, the slumlords had already made their first mistake. They had underestimated Glaswegian women. The housing conditions in Glasgow were already so bad that the Glasgow Women's Housing Association was formed in 1914, and in 1915 they took issue with the extortionate rent prices found in Glasgow. As landlords were evicting families all over the shop, local communities began to organise. Committees in the various districts of Glasgow were formed to resist the rent increases, and none became as important as Mary Barbour's in Govan. They began protesting their rent hikes by sending their landlords the original fee, with the inflated price crossed out. The slumlords of Glasgow didn't take too kindly to this gesture, and returned their cheques demanding the inflated amount. They threatened that if this increased amount wasn't paid, then the women protesting would be evicted. The response from Mary Barbour and her army was typical of Glaswegians. Try it and see what happens. And just like that, the Glasgow rent strikes exploded into life. As the landlords pressed on with their attempts at evictions, the women of Glasgow, led by Mary Barbour, became increasingly more organised. From street meetings to trumpets, they used every tactic they could think of to encourage women to join them in organising a carnival of resistance against the profiteering landlords of Glasgow. This was a time where women were becoming highly politicised, with radical and militant suffragettes like Helen Crawford joining in with the organising of these rent strikes. The inclusion of someone who had spent 3 years in prison prior to the war for, amongst other things, smashing the windows of an army recruitment office in Glasgow should have been a massive warning to the powers that be, yet they still continued to pursue evictions. By this point, thousands of windows across Glasgow declared, "We are not paying increased rent." There was hardly a window without a sign proclaiming support for the rent strikes, and momentum continued to gather. As the landlords chased evictions, the women became more militant. Every time a factor, which is an agent for the landlord, turned up to try and evict someone, pots and pans and bells and trumpets and drums were heard bellowing out, as the women of these working class communities were summoned to strike fear into the landlords' bones. Easy targets were continually sought after by the landlords, and they even went as far as attempting to evict a 70-year-old pensioner who had barricaded himself in his flat. After crowds gathered around the entrance of his tenement flat in support, nobody dared to even attempt to remove him. Women would routinely fend off any factor who unsuccessfully tried to run the gauntlet, with the Glasgow Herald even reporting on one attempt in Partick, where the factor was pelted with bags of flour and chased from the streets by scores of organised women. It was even reported that they went as far as scanting these landlords and their agents. Scanting, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Scottish slang, is the act of pulling another's trousers down, commonly to reveal their scants, aka underwear, or even what is beneath. It is considered the ultimate embarrassment. The women of Glasgow simply feared no man. The strikes continued to grow throughout 1915, and by the time November came around, it was estimated up to 20,000 people in Glasgow were on rent strike. These strikes had begun to spread across Scotland and the rest of the UK, and it was becoming a huge problem for the landlords. Those who they thought were their easiest targets yet, the women of Glasgow, had become the most organised opposition they'd ever faced in their privileged lives. The landlords were becoming increasingly desperate to evict these striking women, and later in the month, one decided to attempt to prosecute 18 tenants. Mary Barbour and her army were furious with this, so they began marching towards Glasgow's Sheriff Court. As the women marched towards the court, they decided to stop by a shipyard on the Clyde. They managed to convince the working men of this shipyard to down tools and join the protest with them. Before the landlords knew it, thousands of working Glaswegians were marching upon Glasgow Sheriff Court. Inside the court, picture mayhem. They were so alarmed by the size of the demonstration that they phoned the government in London for assistance. The government in London instructed them to release the tenants and promised that they would find an amicable solution. Not only was the government so concerned about the size of the rent strikes and the ensuing protests, but the news that shipbuilders and engineers had joined en masse had struck the fear of life into them. Worrying that the rent strikes were a midge's bawhair away from turning into a full-blown general strike, the government finally decided to act. Less than 1 month later, the government passed the Rent Restriction Act of 1915, which decreed that rent must be returned to pre-war levels and remain there for the duration of the war and the 6 months following. This was a monumental victory for the women of Glasgow. They had been threatened with losing what little they did have, and instead of lying down and accepting it, they took on the wealthy and won. Once the 6-month period after the war had passed, the landlords returned once again to hike the rents of working people. After seeing the success of the rent strikes of 1915, mass protests broke out again, and soon enough the landlords had been put back in their place. Following these protests, the Addison Act of 1919 was passed, which brought into existence the very first council houses. Mary Barbour had inspired thousands of women to stand up for themselves and one another. She had led a movement that became one of the greatest examples of the power of direct action and community togetherness. Not only is it inspiring in terms of the sheer volume of participants, but also because ultimately it was successful. It shouldn't be glossed over that during this time, women weren't even allowed to vote, yet we still had the fantastic Mary Barbour organising in our local community to protect the interests of the working class. I think that in itself is a testament to how important community organising can be. Mary Barbour will go down in history as one of the most inspirational women to have ever lived. The victory of Mary Barbour and the women of Glasgow, for the most part, stood the test of time. It was a victory so resounding that parts of the Rent Restriction Act of 1915 remained in force all the way up until 1989, when it was repealed by Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government. The spirit of Mary Barbour was resurrected almost 100 years after the rent strikes, when the Conservative Lib Dem coalition introduced the much-hated bedroom tax. This seen tenants living in council housing with a spare room facing a reduction in their housing benefit, meaning they had to either fund a spare room themselves or face rent arrears and eventually eviction. The bedroom tax received wide condemnation from Glasgow's working class, mainly for its effect on people with disabilities and pensioners. Disabled people who required a spare room for equipment they needed to survive were suddenly faced with potential eviction. Those who had recently lost a child and now by default had a spare bedroom were also liable to the bedroom tax just 3 months after the passing of their child. This created much anger in the working class communities of Glasgow, who once again marched on the streets to demand fairer treatment in the housing sector. Despite the fact that welfare falls under the responsibility of the UK government, the Scottish government also shared this disdain for the bedroom tax, and soon began to mitigate it through discretionary housing payments. The spirit of Mary Barbour now lives on through living rent, which is a tenants' union formed to wrestle back political and economic power for the working class. Operating in much a similar manner to Mary Barbour's army, they have branches in various neighbourhoods where they partake in actions ranging from stopping evictions to upholding appropriate living conditions. They might not rival Mary Barbour's army in terms of numbers, but when it comes to passion and dedication to the cause of standing up for Scotland's working class, they are equals. We're over 100 years past from the Glasgow rent strikes, yet it seems the lessons learned from the successful collective action are alive and well. On Thursday the 13th of May 2021, just before 10 o'clock in the morning, the working class community of Pollockshields in Glasgow stood shoulder to shoulder with their neighbours once again. As agents of the UK government's Home Office attempted to evict and deport 2 men, one passing community member noticed the commotion and threw his bike, and then himself, under their van. Word began to spread about this deportation, and soon hundreds of community members had turned up to block the van and stand in solidarity with their neighbours. The hours passed and the police presence grew, but so did the communities. Chants of "They're our neighbours, let them go" rang out through Kenmure Street as the drums banged and the bells rung. The situation became increasingly tense as the police attempted to remove those sitting down in front of the immigration enforcement van through sheer force. Their efforts were fruitless, and as the day went on, the resistance only became more fierce. It was made extremely clear that the people of Glasgow were not moving. At roughly 6 PM, the van's back doors swung open in a moment that sent chills down spines and gave goosebumps like you've never experienced before. The 2 men were released from the van in what is one of the most monumental moments of resistance we have seen this decade. The man who threw himself and his bike under the van remained there for almost 8 hours. The sheer community spirit displayed in Glasgow, almost a carbon copy of Mary Barbour and her army over 100 years ago, was so profusely moving and highlights perfectly that the people united will never be defeated. Glasgow has a proud history of defending our communities against agents of control attempting to displace our neighbours, and if we continue with that community solidarity, we can also have a proud future. As we enter the precarious years ahead due to the global pandemic, extortionate rent, a hostile environment and inequality so eye-wateringly vast, the lesson is clear. Mary Barbour personified it perfectly, and now we are seeing it on our streets again. The lesson is resolute. United, we stand. If you enjoyed this video, then please do consider subscribing so that you don't miss the next episode of radical stories from Scotland you should know about. Give it a like if you wish, or if you're a Tory then give it a dislike, I really don't care. If you've made it this far in my video then thank you so much for sticking around, and I'll catch you after.